The first thing that hit me when I pushed open that half-latched suite door was not Travis's face, but his voice giving my work away. He was standing too close to Sabrina Dale near the window, and I heard him say, "After this quarter, the clients move with us." My hand stayed on the brass handle while everything went soundless, because a man can explain an affair, but not business theft, whispered like a future. I did not step in right away, and that stillness gave me one more look at the printed guest list on the table beside them. My font, my layout, my color notes, all lifted from the donor deck. I finished 2 nights earlier while Travis called me brilliant at home. Then he turned, saw me, and went white so fast it hurt to watch while Sabrina dropped her hand and stepped back once carefully. "Quinn," he started, but nothing in that room was generous enough to carry the sentence. Not with my guest list open and his future spoken. Sabrina tried the smaller lie first, saying, "This is not what it looks like." And I looked at the papers before I looked at her. What came out of me was calm enough to frighten him, because I asked what mattered. "How far into my business did you take her?" Travis opened his mouth, closed it, and glanced at Sabrina instead of me, which told me more than any clean confession could have that night. Behind me, Owen Barrett stopped just inside the doorway, and I did not need to turn around to know he had already heard enough too. I stood there long enough to understand the marriage was ending in that suite, but the colder truth was that my work ended first there. Before that night in the suite, the damage had been arriving in pieces small enough to excuse, which was why I kept stepping over it inside my own marriage. Travis had started dressing like a man auditioning for a richer life. Sharper jackets, better shoes, a new watch he called necessary because donors noticed details. I noticed something else instead, because every time his phone lit up during dinner, he turned it face down and let the screen die between us. Our studio had always run on a clean division of labor, with me building the visual world and Travis handling partnerships, schedules, and the polished conversations wealthy people liked hearing. Then Sabrina Dale began appearing too often in rooms that had once been mine alone, drifting into tastings, donor briefings, and review calls with a smile that stayed too long. When I asked why she was suddenly attached to so many meetings, Travis barely looked up from his email and said, "She understands this level of client." That answer stayed with me because the next week I opened a presentation draft and found 2 lines of my copy softened into Sabrina's tone without my approval. A few days later, Jocelyn mentioned an invoice coded as consulting support, and the amount was not enormous, but it was large enough to deserve context. Travis brushed it off, the way men brush off things they think they still control, saying, "It's temporary. Quinn, don't make everything heavier than it is." I wanted to believe him because the alternative was uglier than fatigue. And at that point, fatigue was still the kinder story to tell myself. But the evidence kept arriving exactly where evidence always arrives first. In access logs, forwarded files, calendar holds, and that strange new privacy around ordinary hours. By the time I stood outside that suite door and heard him promise clients to another future, I was not discovering something new, only hearing the pieces finally locked together. The gala had all the usual things men like Travis mistook for power: glass walls over dark water, a donor board lit like a shrine, and servers moving as quietly as money. He kept me close for the first half hour, one hand warm against my back, while he introduced me as the creative force behind the studio. But every sentence landed polished and empty, like language built for witnesses instead of a wife. Then he loosened from my side, one conversation at a time. And when I turned after answering a trustee's question about paper stock, he was simply gone. I checked the bar, the terrace, the cluster near the auction display, and with every empty glance, the room became sharper and more false around me. That was when Owen Barrett stepped toward me with a lowball glass in one hand and said, in a tone so controlled it turned my stomach, "Your husband is upstairs with my wife." I looked at him as if calm alone could make him wrong. But his face did not shift. And because it did not shift, every small lie I had lived beside suddenly felt less accidental. We crossed the ballroom without hurrying, which somehow made it worse. Because panic wants speed, and truth does not need it. The staff at the private floor entrance moved aside the moment Owen reached the rope. And that tiny act told me he belonged in a world that opened doors without explanation. Halfway down the hallway, before I touched the suite, I heard Travis's voice through the narrow crack and caught the words "spring launch" and "clients won't follow her forever." And that sentence entered my body colder than the affair ever could. When I pushed the door wider, Sabrina was standing close enough to Travis that there was no honest distance left between them. And on the table sat a donor list and presentation mock-up I recognized instantly. My formatting, my client notes, my exact sequence for the museum dinner reveal. All of it spread open under hotel lamplight, like they had already begun dividing me into usable parts. Travis turned first and went pale. Sabrina's hand dropped from his chest, and his mouth reached for the oldest lie in the room. "Quinn, this is not what you think." I did not answer that sentence because the printed deck on the table had already answered it for me, right down to the margin notes lifted from my file. Sabrina tried next. Softer and more insulting somehow. "We were going to explain." And I looked at her, then at the proposal, then back at Travis. What I asked was the only thing worth asking in a room where my marriage and my work were laid open together. "How long and how far into my business did you take her?" The next morning, Travis came home wearing the same suit and the same exhausted face men wear when they think looking ruined counts as accountability. He started with, "It was a mistake." But the proposal on that hotel table was still sitting in my mind, so I did not argue feelings. I opened my laptop, pulled the studio files, and went straight to the work because once I had seen my donor deck in that suite, denial was no longer available to me. Jocelyn came by before noon, and within 20 minutes, she had the file history open beside the billing screen and the shared calendar. The first thing we found was the museum donor proposal exported from Travis's account to a private address 3 days before the gala. Then we found wording from my original presentation softened into Sabrina's cadence inside a draft, saved under an abbreviated project label I had never authorized. After that, the pattern stopped pretending to be messy and started looking organized, because the invoice Jocelyn had flagged earlier now had companions. There was a consulting payment routed through the studio to an LLC with no clear creative deliverable, and when we matched dates, Sabrina's meetings appeared near every charge. Owen sent over household records from his side, too. Not gossip, not guesswork, just dinners, rides, hotel bar tabs, and calendar overlaps lining up with nights Travis had called client dinners. I sat there looking at the screen while every piece moved into place. And what hurt most was how ordinary the proof looked once it stopped hiding. No single item would have carried the whole betrayal alone. But together, the export trail, the invoice path, and the copied language gave it structure. By the time I closed my laptop, I understood the affair was never the full story. Because people sneaking around for desire do not build billing channels and transition language for after they are done. I called Marin Holt before Travis finished his second apology. And by the time he reached, "We can still fix this," I was already emailing her the file history. She read fast, asked for ownership records, operating documents, account access, and every invoice Jocelyn had flagged, then told me, "Do not warn him before we lock what is yours." That sentence steadied me because the export trail, the copied proposal language, and the consulting payments had already shown me I was not dealing with grief alone. By noon, I had opened a separate account, forwarded the studio formation papers, and signed the divorce filing. Marin prepared with temporary orders attached. Jocelyn exported the cloud logs, vendor permissions, payment processor history, and calendar records before we changed a single password. Because evidence matters most before frightened people start deleting. When the last report downloaded, I revoked Travis's admin access, removed third-party file sharing, and watched his device sessions disappear one by one from the dashboard. The studio had been formed under my ownership, which meant the things that truly kept it alive were not charm, proximity, or donor smiles, but legal control. Marin sent preservation notices that afternoon, locking email, shared drives, calendars, billing records, and messaging platforms into something too formal for Travis to talk around later. When he called and asked, voice tightening now, "Did you really shut me out?" I looked at the login screen, still clear of his name, and answered, "I stopped leaving my work unlocked." That evening, I signed a lease on a small apartment and packed only what belonged to my next life, not the one he had already started dividing. Travis followed me through the kitchen, trying to sound broken, but every word landed against the same facts now. The LLC, the suite deck, the export logs. By the time I carried out my last box, I was no longer reacting to betrayal at all, because once the records were secured, the money separated, and the access closed, grief had lost its leverage, and only consequence remained. The first call came from a museum trustee asking why revised materials had stopped arriving from my usual address and started coming through Sabrina's consulting account instead. I told her the truth in one clean line, that Travis and I were separating, that I had sole creative authority, and that any deck not issued by me should be treated as unauthorized. She went quiet for half a beat, then thanked me in the careful voice people use when they realize the room has shifted beneath their shoes. After that, the calls stopped feeling social and started sounding procedural, which was exactly where consequences become harder to dodge. A vendor wanted to confirm which approval chain still stood. A donor liaison asked whether Sabrina would remain attached to spring planning, and I gave each of them the same answer with no added heat. Travis heard about those conversations by evening and called twice before I picked up, then came in tight and low with, "You're making this worse," and I let the silence sit long enough for him to hear himself. What I was making worse for him was not the affair, because people in that world forgive private mess faster than public uncertainty. What they do not forgive is confusion around authority, billing, access, and provenance, especially after the copied deck, the LLC payment trail, and the revoked permissions were already on record. Within days, one donor paused a commitment. A venue asked for written clarification before moving forward, and the museum board began reviewing duplicate charges and presentation drafts that should never have left my files. Sabrina lost ground the same way Travis did, not through scandal, but through professional recoil that spread quietly from inbox to inbox and table to table. Once people understood she had been presenting from language lifted out of my materials while sleeping with the man forwarding them, she stopped looking polished and started looking expensive to trust. I did not have to humiliate either of them, because the moment I stopped standing between their choices and other people's judgment, their own records began speaking in public for them. The apartment was small in a way that left nowhere for noise to hide. One bedroom, one narrow kitchen, one window facing a row of wet Seattle trees. The first night, I set down my coffee maker, made the bed, and listened to the refrigerator hum like it was proving silence could be steady. I cried only after the room stayed quiet long enough for my body to believe nobody was about to come in and explain away what I had already seen. For weeks, my nerves kept acting like they still lived inside that old house, bracing at every phone vibration, every late hour, every pause before sleep. Then the changes began arriving through details too small to fake. The first full night I slept through. The first dinner I finished. The first morning my shoulders were not locked. I stopped reaching automatically for Travis's mug when I made coffee, and that tiny break in habit felt more honest than any speech he had tried. I started walking before work along a path lined with damp leaves and low branches, And after a while, I noticed I was looking outward again. I noticed the sound of my shoes on gravel, the sting of cold air in my lungs, the way my hands stayed loose instead of curled. Back at the apartment, I pulled out paper stocks, ribbon samples, old ink books, and let my fingers rest on materials that never lied to me. Jocelyn called one morning to ask how I was holding up, and I looked around the kitchen before answering. Lighter than I expected, and sad in a cleaner way. That was the truth of it, because the grief had not vanished, but it was no longer tangled around confusion, deleted messages, or a turned-over phone. By the time winter started thinning at the edges, my body had learned what my mind already knew, that peace is not dramatic when it arrives. It is quiet, specific, and easier to breathe inside. By early spring, Travis and Sabrina tried to return through the same doors they once thought would carry them forward, this time under a cleaner name and without me attached. Their new launch was supposed to be small, polished, donor-friendly, the kind of soft re-entry people in Seattle use when they want scandal to look like reinvention. But before guests had fully settled, one venue contact requested written confirmation on rights to creative samples, and one sponsor paused after recognizing language that had already appeared in disputed files. The trouble did not come from rumor, which was what Travis had counted on surviving, but from materials that still carried their own history. A vendor flagged duplicated metadata in a presentation packet Sabrina circulated, and the file path still traced back to my archived studio library instead of any system they could call original. By the time Marin sent one precise letter attaching prior timestamps, access records, and ownership language, their launch stopped looking fresh and started looking borrowed. Travis called me once that afternoon, his voice rough with the kind of urgency men save for consequences they thought would stay theoretical. And he said, "You do not have to bury this." I stood in my kitchen with my phone against my ear and answered the only thing left worth answering, that I had not buried anything. I had simply refused to resurrect what was never theirs. Later I heard the evening had folded in on itself, half attended, thin on commitments, and quieter than failure usually sounds, which felt fitting because the same kind of room where they once imagined a future had finally closed to them for good. A year later, I walked into another arts benefit with my name printed where it belonged, on the invitation, on the presentation book, and on every approval sheet. Jocelyn stood near the entry reviewing final placements. Marin arrived in a dark coat with the calm expression of someone who had seen the whole thing hold. And for the first time in years, I did not feel managed inside my own life. The room looked expensive in the same familiar way, but nothing in it felt borrowed now, because every detail resting under the lights had come through my hands cleanly. Several former clients crossed the floor to greet me, not carefully, not out of pity, but with the direct warmth people reserve for work they trust. One of them touched the edge of the paper menu, smiled, and said, "This feels like you again." And I let that sentence settle where panic used to live. Later I saw Owen across the room, and all that passed between us was a small nod, which was enough because some people do not need to narrate survival to recognize it. By then, the suite, the copied deck, the vanished access, and the quiet collapse that followed had all taken their proper places behind me. I had a smaller home, steadier mornings, cleaner work, and a life that no longer required me to ignore evidence in order to call it love. What returned to me was not the marriage, not the old version of safety, but something better and harder earned, which was my name standing intact on everything that mattered. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the kind of truth that changes a life. If something here felt close to your own heart, I hope you choose the peace that finally lets you breathe. Stay with me for more stories that find light after loss.